Have scholars found new evidence for Jesus? Hey, I'm Jordan, and this is Bible and Archaeology. We've been sent in a video made by Trent Horn, where he says that scholars have discovered new pieces of evidence for Jesus outside of the Bible. So we're going to walk through his video and see what evidence he puts forward and whether he does a fair treatment of that evidence, be it archaeological or textual. Now, we are not going to be dealing with the theological claims that he makes in this video. Where you want to go with theological claims is outside of this. What we're focusing on is when he turns to archaeology and when he turns to the textual analysis, is he giving those readings and the work of those scholars a fair shake? And so our focus is going to stay there, because if you choose to believe things, questions of belief are questions of belief. What we're going to focus on is that evidence that he says he is putting forward to you that scholars have discovered. So with that, let's see what he has to say.
In today's episode, we're going to examine 3 new pieces of evidence for Jesus that are found outside the Bible. So let's start with the first piece of evidence that some have described as being bigger than the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Number 1, a 3rd century inscription saying Jesus is God.
Okay, we're going to stop already, because this inscription that he's going to get into, I don't know where he says that anyone is saying this is bigger than the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's a very large claim. The Dead Sea Scrolls are one of the most significant finds for our understanding of the text, the textual history, the communities around the texts that become identified as the Bible. So for something to top that, for something to be bigger than that, is a very large claim. There might be people who will say, I've seen this in some news stories related to this, that this is a significant find since the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But to say that this is bigger, I don't know who he would point to back that up. It's not bigger. The Dead Sea Scrolls are not topped by this single inscription.
This one got traction in several 2024 news articles describing an inscription from the year 230 calling Jesus God. Here's one news story about it.
They carefully excavated the mosaic, hiding it securely in northern Israel, until flying it here for a first public appearance.
The table is dedicated to the God Jesus Christ. Now, this phrase, God Jesus Christ, is in the 5th line of the inscription, and it is actually in a shortened form, so the letters that have the lines over them, it is actually a respectful way to write those words.
Dr. Duke believes these early writings are some of the first to show belief in the deity of Jesus, with this inscription from a Christian woman identified as a Keptis that reads God Jesus Christ. The Megiddo mosaic is one he hopes will open up a world of possibilities for future discoveries.
So this early inscription shows that Jesus is God because you only offer sacrificial worship on an altar to God.
Okay, a number of things. First, let's step back before we get to his claims to some of what's going on with the archaeology here. This discovery did make some headlines in 2024, but not because it was found in 2024, but because of something that happened to it in 2024. The Megiddo mosaic was found during excavations in the early 2000s, between 2003 and 2005, when salvage excavations were undertaken in advance of plans to expand a prison in the area. And so as they're doing these excavations, they found these mosaics. They studied them, they identified them, and then they backfilled over them to preserve them. So when that news story says that they were hidden, that's an odd way to phrase this. They knew they were there. They weren't hidden to hide them and keep them secret for anyone. They were backfilled to preserve them until a later date when archaeologists did come back in because expansion was going to happen and they were removed. Now, why did they make stories in 2024? Is it just because they were removed? That's not the real reason why they made headlines. Things are removed all the time. They made headlines because they were loaned temporarily to the Museum of the Bible. And so that loan is then what caused these mosaics to become headline news everywhere, because this is a significant loan to the Museum of the Bible made for potential political reasons. We're not going to get into all of that, but whenever things are loaned like this, there's usually a multitude of reasons behind. Some of it might just be to share it with the world. But it's always possible that there are other ideas behind this as well. So it did make headlines in 2024. It didn't make headlines because it was new in 2024. So calling this new evidence 20 years old, maybe. However, there too, the reference within this mosaic is to God, Jesus Christ. And in the longer version, he goes on to talk about theological claims around the Eucharist. And as he ends here, he says, right, you offer sacrifices to a God. But I'd ask a question here, because we have a wide range of temples and altars and inscriptions to all kinds of deities. Zeus, Apollo, all over the world. There are altars dedicated to individuals identified as gods, and sacrifices are offered. So does that mean that all of those deities are and should be seen by Trent as legitimate gods because there are inscriptions and there are altars that have been made? Because if his claim here is you only offer sacrifices to a god, and this inscription identifies Jesus as God, and therefore this must be evidence of that, we seem to be standing on shaky ground, and ground that he would not want to give to other communities. What this is evidence of is that there was a community who understood, who believed Jesus to be God. Yes, it is evidence of that. It's evidence that this community took the time and the resources to make a mosaic and to put in that God, Jesus Christ. It's not evidence of anything beyond that. This cannot be evidence of the legitimacy of that claim, the proof of that. It can't be that. It can be evidence that they believed this. And this is something that I think is going to run through this entire commentary and his entire video. The way he uses the word evidence, it makes me think of that scene from Princess Bride.
You keep using the word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
Because this is evidence that someone believed Jesus to be God. It's not evidence that Jesus was God. It's also not evidence that Jesus existed, because yes, this inscription comes from the early 200s, but that is not evidence for a historical Jesus either. It's evidence that a community believed in this individual in this way. So to say that this is evidence for Jesus, in this front, I would say no. It's evidence that there's an individual and a community of individuals that believed in Jesus, yes, but not evidence for Jesus, no.
All right, next up is number 2. Jesus' tomb is a garden tomb. John 19:41 says, "Now in the place where he was crucified there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb where no one had ever been laid." In my previous episode on the 2 tombs of Jesus, I talk about the so-called Garden Tomb of Jerusalem. It's popular with Protestants because it lacks the Catholic and Orthodox elements that you find in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. But this Protestant tomb of Jesus also has no good historical claim to being Jesus' actual tomb.
That is fair. The Garden Tomb does not have good standing to be identified as the tomb of Jesus. And if you read any of the literature, or you talk to any of the volunteers there, they also don't really advance that claim. They're happy to let others do it for them. They're happy for it to be a space where you can go to reflect on that, but they do not heavily promote the claim that this should be identified as the tomb of Jesus. They might say things like, this is a kind of tomb that you might see, and this is a rock-cut tomb, and you have some. They play into it, yes, but they themselves don't make it, which is a difficult point here when you try to spend time thinking about or talking about the Garden Tomb, because they lean into it, but don't fully embrace it. So that part, his critique there of the Garden Tomb, is fair.
In contrast, the traditional site of Jesus' tomb within the Church of the Holy Sepulchre does have good evidence for its historicity. Now, you wouldn't think of a picturesque garden tomb in this spot, and it would be hard to know that since the Emperor Hadrian built temples to the pagan gods of Rome over the site of Calvary and Jesus' tomb. Recently, my friend Cameron Bertuzzi did an episode on his channel discussing new archaeological evidence that Jesus' tomb in the Holy Sepulchre was built over a garden. just as it's described in John's Gospel.
Archaeobotanical analyses, which is just a fancy word for studying ancient plant remains, revealed preserved olive pits, grape seeds, and pollen trapped in sealed soil layers beneath the church floor. And these weren't just like random seeds scattered about. They were actually neatly organized into terraced planting beds lined by low stone walls. Exactly what you'd expect to see in a cultivated garden from the 1st century. As if that weren't enough, researchers also uncovered several rock-cut tombs carved directly into the bedrock. And these weren't just caves formed by nature, they were purposefully hand-chiseled chambers dating precisely to the era around Jesus' crucifixion. Again, just as the Gospels describe.
Okay, we need to unpack a couple things again here. First, I would say, I find it very odd that you're using an AI rendering image to try to show botanical remains in the hand of an archaeologist, right? That just strikes me as a little bit odd when you're wanting to present the evidence here. Turn instead to the photos. The use of AI when we're trying to talk about archaeology gets very sticky, I believe, because it's not representing something that's really there. Small quibble there, but let's talk about some of how he described those remains. The way he frames them makes it sound like you walked into somebody's backyard and that the archaeologist said, we have these raised beds and look, they're all organized and everything is here and exactly as you might expect this garden to look. If we turn to the preliminary report from the archaeologists that came out, what they say is modest spaces filled with earth were enclosed by dry stone walls. Here, paleobotanical analysis has observed remains of cereals, grapes, figs, and gramineous plants. So we don't have a clear row of seeds. We don't have overly structured items. Instead, what we have, as they say, the later frequentation of quarry areas is documented by a cultivated area, and that these types of cultivated areas are not uncommon. So yes, there were plant remains here, and yes, they were found in areas that are like garden beds between these dry stone walls, but they themselves are not these highly organized garden beds that it feels like he wants you to imagine them to be. So a small distinction there, but a misrepresentation, I would say, of the way they are presenting their understanding and the finds of the seeds that they had. We also need to talk about the tombs that he showed in that video. Because while they do talk about, yes, that there seems to be wider understandings of funerary practice here and the repurposing from this area being a quarry into some of that area turning into use for graves, and then some of that becoming place that gets used for vegetal gardens, right? A process they say that happens other places as well, that's not extremely uncommon. The tombs he showed are not from those new excavations. The tombs that he showed there are tombs that if you go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre today, you can go and see, and you've been able to see for a very long time. That's the tomb that gets identified as the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. It's a series of 5 rock-cut tombs, 2 of which you can see. Those weren't new finds. And so again, this time a little bit of a further step than the AI, what he's bringing in to back up visually his claims feels misleading. Whether it's intentional, whether he's misunderstanding, I don't know. But in this case, you're showing graves that are not the tombs, the graves, the funerary structures that the archaeologists are looking at. Those are something completely different. And so that feels just completely off the mark and a way to try to present to you an idea of something that is not what they're describing. That's the kind of thing that makes videos like this very difficult because it says we're going to give you evidence, but then it misrepresents the evidence that it has coming from not just the archaeological preliminary report, but then the images that it gives you. It's a reason to hold these types of claims with some suspicion.
There is no way to directly prove a miracle like the resurrection or Christ's ascension through archaeology. But historical sciences do provide empirical facts that can lead to a supernatural conclusion.
This then is a problem for the whole video. There's no way to prove this through archaeology. And yet the premise of this video is evidence for Jesus. Now, he will probably try to, if you were to push him on this, create a distinction between, well, I'm not saying evidence for everything that is there, but it can lead you to, make supernatural deductions for other pieces. But you're turning towards archaeology and texts here in a minute to support these claims, while also saying that those archaeological things cannot support those claims. So I want them to be evidence, but I will acknowledge that they can't be evidence. So then what's the purpose of this video? If you can't prove it through archaeology, then why are you trying to use archaeology to prove it? If you say that you can't, then don't. Then just don't. Then leave it as a matter of belief and go from there. But when you try to bring archaeology in to prove it, and then also acknowledge that archaeology can't prove it, you've created for yourself a problem.
For example, critics like John Dominic Crossan claim Jesus wasn't buried in a tomb at all, and his body, like the body of other criminals, was thrown in a pit to be devoured by wild animals. And so he claims the gospel account is a legend about his burial in a tomb. But archaeological finds like the skeleton of a man named Jehohanan show that crucified criminals were buried in tombs. Also, Kathryn is not saying, here's a tomb, therefore Jesus is God, like in Woodford's Troy example.
Okay, we've talked about the Jehohanan heel bone before. We've done this in a podcast. You can go and watch that. But a comment worth making again here is this is one piece of evidence for an individual who seems to have been crucified because of the nail bone and the presence of wood left on that nail itself, having been buried. However, what that can't prove to you is why was he allowed to be buried and when was he interred there? That heel bone was found in an ossuary. Ossuaries are, by definition, secondary burials. Typically, what happens is the body is laid out, and then once it has desiccated, the bones are gathered and they're placed into the ossuary. This leaves open, though, the possibility that someone's reading, like John Dominic Crossan's, that you were buried somewhere else first. It doesn't preclude you from having done that. Individuals then going and taking that body, then taking it somewhere else to allow it to desiccate and then be placed into the ossuary. That's a possible path. Another possible path is, as scholars have said from studying the Jehohanan heel bone, is that it seems the family who owned the ossuary into which the heel bone was placed were well off, aristocratic, and that they may have had connections and abilities not granted to everyone. So maybe they were able to pull in a favor or pay someone off to be able to have this happen. Either path you want to go or a different path altogether, the presence of one heel bone connected to crucifixion does not establish the general practice that everyone that was crucified was allowed to be buried. It opens the possibility that it could happen, yes, but it does not establish it as the common way. It does not establish it as common Roman practice. It allows it to be an outlier and an outsider, one that they want to use to say, well, see, it happened there, so it could happen here as well. That's could. But again, we're going towards how do you want to use archaeological evidence and to support what? Because he is not being consistent in what this type of evidence can do for him.
Not saying, here's a tomb, therefore Jesus is God, like in Woodford's Troy example. Kathryn's saying it's striking that the traditional tomb of Christ in a 4th century church also happens to be around other tombs that were built centuries earlier, thus confirming this site was not part of a later legend, but fits perfectly with the claim that Jesus of Nazareth was killed and then buried among other new tombs. And the same is true of there being a garden, which, contrary to Woodford's claim, weren't all over the place, but would be a unique thing to find in this location that further corroborates John's claims.
3 things. First, the first piece of evidence, the mosaic, that was one that you wanted to say, well, here's this inscription. They refer to Jesus as God, therefore Jesus must be God. But now in the second piece, you want to back off and say, well, we're not saying that the presence of this must mean that Jesus is God. Be consistent in the way you want to use archaeology and how you identify this evidence within your arguments. Is it that or isn't that? Because if you can't make that claim here, then why were you able to make it just a few minutes ago? Could you not make it there? And if you did make it there, then why are you not making it here? You need to be consistent. Again, I don't think evidence means what he wants it to mean. It means whatever he wants it to be as he wants it to be. Second, The idea here that, well, there seems to have been this happening, so it can't be this later retelling that comes off, falls a little bit short, because it could very well have existed as a site that was a garden that was connected to burials, yes. And then if you want to take the view that this is a myth, the mythicist reading that either Jesus isn't real or that all of this story is made up around it, it doesn't have to be something later that's completely creating everything wholesale. It could be the option of there was something there, these areas were around into which stories were stitched. Much like, as we talked about with our recent video, that destruction can give the grounds for a story to be brought in. It might be a site in search of a story. Something similar could be happening here. The third thing that I think we need to acknowledge is here he wants to use materials from the archaeological preliminary report, but also not use the arguments the archaeologists make in their preliminary report, because they say that these types of areas are common. So while he's saying, the critique is that this would be common, but it wouldn't be common at all, that goes against what the archaeologists claim. They say, as with other known contexts in Jerusalem, this quarry was widely used for exploitation, funerary purposes, and agricultural cultivation of small areas bordered by dry stone walls. As with other known contexts, meaning this area is not unique. We know of this happening in other places in Jerusalem. Not just other places all over the place, other places here. So it does appear to be fairly common according to the archaeologists, who you want to believe for some of this, but then want to ignore their arguments for other parts. Be consistent in how you use their work. Be consistent in how you use the work of the archaeologists. Take it or leave it. And if you disagree with something, fine, but acknowledge the parts that you disagree with and say why you disagree with them and based on what evidence, instead of just ignoring it altogether. When it's just ignored, you should ask questions of why it's being ignored.
All of this confirms historical details that make the natural facts supporting the resurrection more reliable.
One last thing before we go on to their last piece, because there's a quote from the lead archaeologist that I think would fit very well into his video if he wanted to include it, and so I think would fit very well into this one. When asked about the relationship between some of these findings and the gospel accounts, in an interview done with the Catholic News Agency, and we can put the article down below in the description. It reads, while certain findings may seem to support the gospel narratives, the archaeologists urge question, quote, that kind of reasoning is misleading. Scientific research provides data. Interpretation comes afterward. As archaeologists, we are responsible for offering a historical interpretation, but there is also a personal, subjective interpretation. What I find misleading is the attempt to base reasons that are purely matters of faith, trying to substantiate it with scientific data. From my point of view, this does a disservice, both to faith and to history. So the archaeologists, when asked about this exact type of argument, people coming in and saying, we have looked at your archaeology and look, doesn't this perfectly match what the Gospels say? They say, leave that alone. Let the archaeology be the archaeology. Your faith, your beliefs are a question of your faith and your beliefs. To try to force the two together, you are going to, as he has done, leave things out that does a disservice to the archaeology and that does a disservice to the textual record as well. So if you're engaging with archaeology, you need to engage with the archaeology. The interpretation comes afterward, but acknowledge where your interpretive biases might lead you. Number 3.
A new defense of Josephus' testimony about Jesus. Some people ask me if there's evidence for Jesus outside the Bible, and there is. But even if there weren't, the Bible is not an invalid source. It's like many other ancient documents, and so it can be used to demonstrate truths about the ancient world. That said, there are some early non-Christian witnesses to Jesus. One of them is Flavius Josephus. In Book 20 of the Antiquities, Josephus refers to the brother of Jesus who was called Christ, whose name was James, which nearly all scholars believe is authentic.
There isn't anything that nearly all scholars agree on. There are a number of scholars that think this phrase is authentic. There are a number of scholars who do not. There is no consensus in the academic community on anything. And if anyone tells you that there is, they either don't know what they're talking about or they are intentionally misleading you.
What's more controversial is Book 18 of the Antiquities, where Josephus says this: "About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. For he was one who performed surprising deeds, and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Christ. And when upon the accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had condemned him to a cross, those who had first come to love him did not cease. He appeared to them, spending a third day restored to life, for the prophets of God had foretold these things, and 1,000 other marvels about him. And the tribe of the Christians so called after him has still to this day not disappeared." Most scholars believe Josephus did refer to Jesus, but that this passage has been subject to Christian revisions over time. That's because Josephus was an unconverted Jew, so he would never have said Jesus was the Messiah or the Christ. This past May, T.C. Schmidt.
There are disagreements in the reading, whether there was a reference to Jesus here at all, whether there was one that was brought in, how much might have been there, how much might have been expanded. There's wide disagreement within the scholarly community on this because of some of the tone and phrases that are included within this, as it has been read by many to sound very creedal in nature, in a way that sounds both later than Josephus and in a way that disagrees with what Josephus says elsewhere. And so there's been, for a long time, a wide range of skepticism over this passage. And whether you want it to be all Josephus, meddled with in different phases, how much meddled with over time, it's been a place of debate.
Who earned a PhD at Yale, has published a book with Oxford University Press called Josephus and Jesus: New Evidence for the One Called Christ. Schmidt has done extensive word analysis of the passage to show that the vocabulary adheres to Josephus's style. It's not something the typical forger would produce.
Dr. Schmidt's work is fascinating. Right now it's available open access from Oxford University Press, so you can go and download a digital copy and read it for yourself. We are going to have Dr. Schmidt on the podcast here before too long to talk about this because I think his argument is very, very interesting. But I would recommend going and reading the book because he lays out some complexities that are going to be left out of the summary you're about to hear.
Schmidt's also shown the passage fits in the context of the surrounding narrative in Josephus and has answered many similar objections claiming the passage is not authentic. He also does a good job showing how Josephus's original testimony about Jesus was probably neutral or even negative. Other manuscripts show that the phrase, "he was the Christ," was probably rendered, "he was called Christ," which matches what Josephus says in Book 20. And the line about Jesus appearing to the disciples on the third day probably went more like this given the grammar of the passage and the textual evidence. He appeared to them to be alive on the third day, given that the divine prophets had spoken such things and many other marvels about him.
So again, what we have, according to Dr. Schmidt's reading, which does take the translation of this and proposes slight changes to say it's been read this way, which has led to some misinterpretation, according to Dr. Schmidt, and instead leans towards this reading that he proposes is right neutral or even negative. Neutral or negative, not a positive rendering through some of this ambiguity that appeared to them in this way, that they believed these things. So what do we have in Josephus's description? One of these earliest references to Jesus, if it is original, it is an ambiguous, neutral at best, negative at worst description of what some individuals believed, much like we had in the first piece of evidence that he put forward, that there is a description of what an individual or a community of individuals believe. So what Josephus is telling us is these individuals, if you take Dr. Schmidt's reading and have it as original, these individuals believed this about this man. Is that evidence for Jesus? No. It's evidence that Josephus, if you give it to Josephus, had heard this about this community. It's evidence of nothing more than that.
In other words, Josephus was describing what the disciples believed or what it appeared to the disciples without necessarily endorsing their beliefs.
So then it's not evidence. It's Josephus describing what they believed without endorsing it. It's Josephus describing what they thought without fact-checking it. He is presenting to you, if you give this to Josephus, what he has been told about these communities. Now, some will argue that this should be considered as a hostile witness and therefore be given more value because, well, why would he want to say this? And so because he's still acknowledging it, it has weight and it needs to be folded back in. But I would ask, much like we had with the first piece of evidence, it's describing what an individual believes. And then because of that, and because it attributes this Jesus as God in the Megiddo Mosaic, in this instance, again, we have other descriptions in Josephus of messianic figures, just like we have other archaeological finds that describe gods and sacrifices being offered to gods. So, if Josephus is giving us descriptions of other messiahs and the fact that there were communities that believed in the claims and the work of those figures, should they be seen also as legitimate and their claims as legitimate? Is Josephus evidence that those messianic claimants were legitimate? If this one is, why are those not? Be consistent in the way you want to apply your arguments and your analysis, whether it's with the archaeology or whether it's with the textual records. Because if this is this here for Jesus, why is it not the same for a variety of other messianic claimants that Josephus tells us about? There, he would say, as he does here, Josephus is describing what they said about themselves or what they believed. It's evidence of that. It's not evidence of the truth of their claims. So why did you include this within this? Because it's not evidence of that. It's not evidence that Josephus is vouching for, backing up, or proving those claims about Jesus. It's just not.
So those are three new pieces of evidence for Jesus from outside of the Bible.
So the summary of this, most of this is not new, whether it's the Megiddo Mosaic that was found in the early 2000s, the archaeology that's going on below the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which has been happening for a long time, or this reading of Josephus, which Dr. Schmidt is presenting in a new way, but has been something that has gone on for a long time. None of these claims are new. None of this is new evidence. And I would also argue that none of this is evidence for Jesus outside of the Bible. It is evidence for largely what individuals believed about Jesus, or some evidence about a practice that's happening at the place where this church was built. But it is little more than what it is at surface level. Evidence of context, evidence of belief of some individuals, evidence of historical practice. It's not evidence of Jesus. If there's another video out there that you would like a response to that you feel like deserves some treatment and insight, put it down in the comments. Let us know. For all of us here at Bible and Archaeology, be sure to like and subscribe. It helps us. Hopefully it helps you. Stay in touch with us. Until next time.